want to welcome you tonight, and we're hoping our live stream students will join us. This class is the first time ever taught in the Heritage Discipleship Institute, a study of the book of 1 Corinthians. And we're saying the theme of our study on 1 Corinthians is wisdom in facing problems. And it is a very powerful and important book of our Bibles. And actually, why do you, that book of Acts, what book is listed? What's the book after Acts? Is what? Is Romans. Why is Romans after Acts? Was it because Romans was Paul's first epistle that he wrote? No. What was the first epistle that Paul wrote? That's right. You guys are so, wow, how did you know that? Okay. So why isn't Galatians first? Why is Romans first? Because Romans is his most important epistle. And it is a book of great doctrine. And 1 Corinthians is next. And maybe that has to do something with its length. It's one of the longer epistles with Romans. But it's also a very important letter for the church. So this class will study 1 Corinthians, wisdom in facing problems. So as we begin tonight, let's look to the Lord in prayer. And I would like to ask if Joni, could you please lead us in prayer as we begin tonight?
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity that we have tonight, Lord, to study your word. I just pray that you would open our hearts and minds to learn about 1 Corinthians, Lord, and to listen to you so that we can have wisdom in facing our problems. And I just lift up everything to you. In Christ's precious name we pray, amen.
Amen. Okay, if you look please on page 2, and you'll see a syllabus of our class. Our first quiz will be in just 2 weeks on September 25th. And the memory verse for that quiz will be, if you could write this down, please, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 18. 1 Corinthians 1:18. For preaching cross to them that perish is foolishness, but unto us which are saved, it is the power of God. That's a great verse. So that will be our first memory verse from Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 18. All right. So this class will go up to December 4th, so you can do your Christmas shopping. You got the month of December. So I would just, you guys are all faithful. You've been in the Institute now, and you're taking classes, so you know what to expect. So the dropout thing is well behind us, but it's always good to start something. But it's better to finish it. So just to remind you, with God's help, let's be finishers, and let's work hard this semester. And maybe we will have an oral presentation in this class, because I know Edgar's looking forward to that. He's going to be first. Edgar's going first. But maybe we should do an oral presentation in Corinthians, because you guys do such a great job with that. Don't you learn more through your oral presentations?
Amen.
There you even Joni said amen.
Just study more.
Right.
You need to prepare more.
Yeah, well, you know what? You learn more when you study the word, and to present yourself, you will learn far more than just sitting there listening to somebody else. All right? So we'll talk more about that, and then we'll assign you different weeks going ahead. We're not going to finish the book of Corinthians this semester. It's going to be a 2-semester class, so we'll probably try to get about halfway through. If you look actually in your book, in your assignments, we're just getting up to chapter 6. Mm-hmm. So, and the way that I have this is that you're going to read chapter 1 for like 2 weeks, and then do the part 2, and also you should do the questions at the back of the chapter. They have study questions.
In the book?
Yes.
Do you have
Yeah.
like any pages for Trilliums Part 1 and Trilliums Part 2?
No,
or-
no, just do half.
Okay.
It doesn't really matter. Just try to do half. It's not, just use your own discretion on that. And then at the back, try to answer the questions for personal reflection or group discussion. And if you have any questions, definitely bring those questions in, because we want to talk about any questions that you may have. All right, any questions? All right, now please, your book. And the introduction is good. And actually in the newer edition, this is not in the older edition book that I have, this first little chapter, The Big Idea. This was written by a man named Ken Ball. And so that's new in this newer edition. And then the background of the church. So we're going to just look at background information of Corinth. And really there's a lot of information here that we want to get through tonight. Okay, so here's church. We're on the notes now on page 3. And these notes are downloaded on our website, where you go to the live stream section, and then they're in either a PDF format or a Word format. So you can download the notes as well. Okay, so there is no perfect Christian and no perfect church. We know that. All churches have problems. And so Paul deals with some very sticky, difficult issues in the church. Now, just by way of introduction, go to page 11, please, in your Wiersbe book. And does anyone still need a book by Wiersbe? Does everybody have one that wanted one? We had enough. Oh, I think I've run out for now. But you could take mine home if you like. You could read it. I'll get another one. Yeah. Okay, look on page 11. And so I think I'm going to be pretty much in simpatico with what is written here regarding the theme of Corinthians as we look at this. He says, as you read through 1 Corinthians, you'll quickly discover this church had a daunting list of problems, okay? So that's our theme, wisdom in facing problems, that were undermining the effectiveness of their witness and vitality of their faith. Some church members were grumbling against Paul, his non-intellectual approach to evangelism. Some were living in unbelievable sexual sin. Others were suing each other in court. Members had questions about whether or not to get married or stay single, questions about divorce, questions about eating meat sacrificed to idols, questions about how women should dress during worship. Okay. The rich were insulting the less affluent at the Lord's Supper. The use of spiritual gifts was tainted with pride. Some people were skeptical about the future resurrection of the dead. The Apostle Paul was so concerned about the people in this church that he wrote one of the most practical of all his letters, advising the Corinthians to apply what? Spiritual wisdom. Okay, so what's our theme? Wisdom in facing problems. So that's basically what he says there. And I came up with the theme before I even read that, so must be on the right track. In fact, I believe you could sum up 1 Corinthians like this: God's wisdom applied to worldly problems produces supernatural results. So wisdom in facing problems, we need the supernatural results. Okay, let's get into this. The city of Corinth. Now, Rome destroyed Old Corinth in 146 BC, but then it was reestablished as a Roman colony. It quickly regained much of its former beauty. So, it is a Roman colony. Corinth was a mega city of its day. It was the capital of Achaia, on the cutting edge of success. Its population, estimate, not really sure, but this is what I read somewhere along the way, was between 600,000 and 700,000. It was a city of great diversity, had tremendous money-making potential, and we'll see why. So many travelers and traders from all over were attracted to Corinth. This is one of the best quotes that I've read through the years. I read this quote in a book, I don't know where it was, years ago, but I've used this quote in my preaching, actually, because I preached through about the city of Corinth. My life's verse is Acts 18:10, where Paul was in Corinth. I have much people in the city, Acts 18:10. So I came across this verse. It kind of reminds you of 42nd Street as it used to be,
Yeah.
Look at that. Who could read that for us? Edgar? Okay.
At night, its streets were hideous with the brawls and lewd songs of drunken revelry. In the daytime, its markets and squares swarmed with Jewish peddlers, grain traders, sailors, soldiers, athletes in training, boxers, wrestlers, charioteers, racing men, betting men, slaves, idols, parasites, and of every description, a veritable pandemonium.
A pandemonium of craziness when the lights go out. So Corinth, it was a multicultural seaport city, highly populated, prosperous, known for its athletic games called the Isthmian. Why Isthmian? We'll see in just a moment. So they attracted the finest athletes in the world. Its population was moving. It was a city on the move. You know, people coming and people going. Reminds you of where? Manila. No, just kidding. Yeah, it reminds you of New York City. And Manila, or any really major city in the world. I mean, if we were in London, we would say, well, it reminds us of London. Or if you're in Manila, yes. Right? No. Maybe not so much movement. Well, whatever. I don't know what I'm talking about right now, actually, about Manila. What do I know about Manila? It's like,
A lot.
a lot. I was there. So this made Corinth a city that could widely disseminate the gospel. So put on by letter B somewhere, politically. This is more like some political aspects, or at least know this, that politically, Corinth was the capital city of what? Achaia, or Achaia. I'm not exactly sure which way to go on that. Now, geographically, and if you go to the next page, there's actually a map there. That came out pretty well in your notes, right? Yes. So when I say Achaia, that's the southern part of what is now we call Greece. And we see Athens is on the other side of Achaia there, or through this isthmus. Now, what is the isthmus? It's that strip of land that's connecting Achaia, that's really connecting Corinth to Athens as well. So the Isthmian Games are named for that isthmus. And it's really that isthmus that gives Corinth so much importance of its day. So let's read why. Geographically, letter B. Corinth was located on a narrow, it's hard to say, isthmus.
That's like Panama.
Okay, yeah. Panama's an isthmus. So you could spell it I-S-T-H-M-U-S. That's how you spell it. And I'll just say isthmus.
What is it again, Pastor?
What? I-S-T-H-M-U-S. So this isthmus secured its commercial prosperity. Traffic went from Athens through Corinth along this isthmus. It was about 4 miles long. That's point number 2. 4-mile long isthmus. It's between the Ionian and Aegean seas. Merchants and sailors chose, and this is interesting, they chose to send their dangerous merchandise across the isthmus rather than taking the dangerous voyage around the rocky coast of the South Peloponnese. So look there at the map and see what we're talking about. Rather than go all the way south around the bottom of Achaia, that was a very dangerous journey. They would rather go through that canal and to the isthmus and transport their goods over that isthmus and carry on. So, excuse me? The isthmus is this narrow piece of land right in here. That's the isthmus.
Right by Athens?
Between Athens and Corinth. Between Athens and Corinth. So, in other words, rather than sail all the way around the Peloponnese, they would sail, if they were coming from Rome, they would sail through here. They would sail through that bay area, and then they would transport their goods across the isthmus. And notice here, I have a few things in your notes about this. There was a saying of those who took this treacherous journey, a sailor never takes a journey around which area, until he first writes his will. They were what they call pirates, and there still are. And remember, our Marines are called leathernecks because of the pirates, Muslims, who slice their necks. That's why they were called leathernecks. They put leather around their necks. So the Muslim pirates, the Barbary pirates, was some of the first. That's where the Marines came about, right, brother? In the early parts of our nation. But anyway, there were these pirates back then. Not that there were Muslims per se. Islam didn't start till later, but they had some of those similar ideas. Number 5, smaller ships were hauled across the isthmus by means of a ship tramway. So they rigged it up. They had a tramway that could tram, T-R-A-M way, tramway. They had a system of wooden rails to haul the smaller ships across that tramway. Larger ships had their cargo unloaded and transported. Now that would seem to me to be a lot of work, right? But at least you had your life at the end of that work. So this, you could see where this made Corinth even more vibrant. So much activity. People coming and going, sailors and traders and everything else. So that's geographically a little bit about Corinth. So geographically, the most important thing, you need to know it was right along this isthmus. And then politically, it was the capital of what area of Greece? Achaia. So Corinth was a natural stopping place from Rome and moving more toward the east. And now we could say letter G, you could almost say morally now, morally. Corinth was known for its moral corruption. Leon Morris, in his commentary, said this. He said, the ideal of the Corinthian was the reckless development of the individual. The merchant who made his gain by all and every means. The man of pleasure surrendering himself to every lust. The athlete steeled to every bodily exercise and proud in his physical strength are the true Corinthian types. In a word, the man, that should be the man who recognized no superior and no law but his own desires. What is he saying about the Corinthians? What is he saying there? When they decided to do something, how'd they do it? All out. If you were going to be an athlete, I'm all in. I'm going to train. I'm going to exercise. I'm going to steel my body. I'm going to do whatever it takes to win those games. But if I'm going to seek for pleasure, I'm going to do that too. So that was the Corinthian way. And I don't have this in your note, but many times the word Corinthian became known in the ancient world for just like a fornicator, an adulterer, a morally corrupt. You're a Corinthian, you know? Yeah, bad connotation. Why? Well, religiously, it was a religious center, letter G. It was a religious center and had a temple. So the blank there is religious center. As most of the major cities, again, in the ancient world and even the modern world are. They're places of religion.
Pastor, you mean H, right? It's E.
G-H, you're right. Yeah, there's 2 G's there. We always catch my mistakes here. Yeah. I've caught like 3 of them already. Okay.
You miss F.
E-F. Oh, thank you, Tony. Spoken like a real school teacher. You're right. You know what? I looked at that too before. You know, before I print it out, I usually look A, B, C.
F is in the queen.
There's 2 B's.
F is in the queen.
There's 2. This is totally messed up. There's 2 B's, no F's, 2 G's. Now you know why I don't do good at Scrabble. Okay. This is a comedy show. Okay. Just think we just started. We have just begun. Okay. Okay, so So on your quiz, you have to know how many G's are in the section, okay? That's very important. That's what you need to know. And definitely know that I skipped F. You better get that one right, Joe. Okay.
There's no DS.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Yes.
What?
You will get
Oh, what? I'm
100
getting
in the
green.
first quiz.
I'm turning like so red up here.
Oh.
Okay. Okay. Wow. I definitely need a copy editor, don't I? This is what happens when you do it yourself. All right. So the second letter, G. Corinth was a religious center and had a temple for Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The temple normally housed 1,000 temple priestesses, were nothing more than ritual prostitutes. And many, I think even in, he mentions this, that if you want to know, if you look on page 20, this is a good statement here. He says, if you want to know what Corinth was like, read where in your New Testament? What does he say on page 20, the first paragraph down?
Romans 1:18-30.
Yeah, Romans 1, 18 to 32. And what passage is that? That's the complete breakdown of morality, men with men and women with women, and all of the wickedness and the lust. Paul wrote the book of Romans when he was in this region of Achaia and when he was in Corinth. As we looked at that verse the last time, it says where he came into Greece. Remember that verse that we looked at before, where he was there for 3 months. It says he came into Greece. So he was there in Corinth when he wrote the book of Romans. Okay. So religiously, it was a religious center of temple prostitution, a temple to Aphrodite. Morally, it was wicked. It was corrupt. Geographically, it had the isthmus. Politically, it was the capital of Achaia. Those are the key points there. Let's see if we do better. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. Okay, on the next section.
Yes.
Here we go. We just did the copy editing. We're moving forward. Paul and the Corinthians. Paul's relationship with the Corinthians was complex and multi-dimensional. His relationship with the Corinthians, probably more is said of that in his writings and in the New Testament than the other churches. So let's look at some of these things. In all, how many letters do you think Paul wrote to the Corinthians? No. How many?
Wasn't it like 5?
Well, I have 4, but that's good. So somewhere between 2 and 5. So we'll say 4. All right? So he wrote 4 letters to the Corinthians, 2 of which are lost, and he made 3 visits to them. His ministry to Corinth began on his second missionary journey. He first visited them. He was, letter A now, the human instrument. He was the human instrument to plant this church. I like what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 3. How did the great apostle Paul go into Corinth? With great confidence and boasting. No, he came amongst them how? It says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 3, how was he amongst them? With what? Bailey?
And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling.
Thank you, Bailey. How do I know I could call on you and you're right there? Good job. With weakness and fear and trembling. And the book of Acts tells us how long Paul ministered in Corinth when he went. And I love that. Because Paul he had fire under his feet. Paul didn't stay in any one place very long. I mean, in Thessalonica, he was just there for literally a few weeks. But in Corinth, it says in Acts chapter 18, verse 11, Acts chapter 18, verse 11, he was with them for how long?
18 months.
It says it right there. You're right. 18 months, exactly. 1.5 years. Do you know why? It was because God told him there's a lot of fish in Corinth. And so if somebody says, hey, there's a fishing pond over there, it's really good fishing. So you're going to fish there for a while, you know. And so God says, I have much people in the city. And so Paul planted his feet there, and he stayed there for 1.5 years serving the Lord. Okay, so after Paul, and we're just going to follow through on this a little bit now. And this is also on page 17 in the background at the Church of Corinth in your book. If you follow along here a little bit. After he ministered in Corinth, he wrote another letter to them. That letter is called the, what does it say on page 17, second paragraph? What does it say? That letter is called what? The lost letter. And you might say, is this recology? Are you just making this up? That Paul wrote a letter and it was lost? No. How do we know that, though? Well, look in 1 Corinthians. Look, please, in chapter 5 and verse 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. What does that say there? And who's got that verse? Who's got that? Who's got that? Okay, Paris, can you please read that?
I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators.
Okay, he said he wrote to them in an epistle. But wait a minute. This is 1 Corinthians. So there had to have been a letter before this one in a letter that he wrote. So we look at that and say, well, that letter was lost. Okay, letter C. Paul received feedback from the house of Chloe. Now, how would you have liked to have been the house of Chloe in Corinth, you know? He's kind of like really telling Paul what's going on there. And now Paul's, I heard from the house of Chloe, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11, that there are contentions among you. So Chloe, C-H, how do you spell that again? L-O-E. You spelled it the right way over there. That's good. So the house of Chloe, of church dissension. And then it seems this letter, and I'm not so clear here under letter C. So when it says, then a letter was sent to him from the church. I'm sorry. So the Corinthians sent Paul a letter asking him questions. For example, look in 1 Corinthians 7. We're going to look at these verses that I have referenced here. So he heard something from the house of Chloe, and perhaps this was in the same correspondence, but in chapter 7, verse 1, what does it say there? Who's got that? Audrey, do you have that? Chapter 7, verse 1.
No, concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to talk about.
Okay, so this book is responding to a letter that they wrote to Paul. Okay? So what is leading him to write the book of 1 Corinthians? Well, he loved them. He started their church. He wrote to them a letter not to have company with fornicators. Did they listen to that? No, because of the sins that were going on there. Then the house of Chloe writes to him and says, there's these dissensions and fightings amongst the church over different parties. There's a party spirit, almost like a denominational spirit, if you will, in the church. And then they write him other questions about things, about marriage, about divorce, about the Lord's Supper, about liberty and things. So really from chapter 7 on, he's answering their questions. It's like Paul's answers to their questions, Q&A. Okay. So this letter, so when I say this letter, I'm talking about 1 Corinthians now, was probably carried to Paul. I'm sorry, I'm wrong. This letter, I'm sorry, the letter I'm still talking about the letter from the Corinthians to Paul. That's what I'm talking about. This letter from the Corinthians to Paul was probably carried to him by Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. 1 Corinthians 16, 17, those men are mentioned. So Paul gets a letter from them. After Paul receives this letter from them, he sends Timothy to them. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 4. So he says, let me send Timothy and try to help them solve some of these messes in the church. It's a messy church. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, he says, "For this cause have I sent unto you Timotheus, who is my beloved son, faithful in the Lord, who shall bring you into remembrance of my ways which be in Christ, as I teach everywhere in every church." And if you go also in chapter 16, at the end there, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 10, he mentions, "Now if Timotheus come, see that he may be with you without fear. He worketh for the Lord, as I also do." Maybe that's in another visit after that. But since we're in this chapter, look at verse 17, because I mentioned this verse from the point previous. These men, where Paul says, "I'm glad of the coming of Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, for that which was lacking on your part they have supplied." So it seems that these men came from Corinth to Paul. What did they tell Paul? They told him about what Chloe had said. Maybe there was something related to Chloe or her correspondence. Then they had other questions. And so he receives this letter from them. He sends Timothy to confront and try to heal some problems. The situation gets worse. Then letter E, Paul's authority as an apostle was being called into question. And that's what he deals with in chapter 9, where Paul has to again defend his apostleship. Because if Paul is not an apostle, if Paul's not an apostle, then his whole salvation experience can be called into question as well. So then, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
So when did Paul become an apostle?
When did Paul become an apostle? I believe when the Lord Jesus met him, he called him. Because an apostle has to be personally called by Jesus. And that's when he met Paul, and then he commissioned him, and he said that he would be sent forth. So
was it after on the road to Damascus, or that was the time?
Well, that's a good question. When was Paul called to be an apostle in that specific sense? It seemed that he was set apart for the apostleship from that moment. Now, whether he was called, the Lord did train the disciples before he called apostles. Maybe there was a level of training there. And then when Paul was sent out by the church, and then when he was writing letters, he referred to himself as an apostle. That's a good question. Does anybody have an answer to that? Actually, there's another answer. Is there any other feedback or ideas about that? Or is there something I'm not thinking where the actual moment he became an apostle? Do you think it was when he called him on that Damascus road? Do you think at that moment? Or do you think he needed some training before he could be officially called an apostle? Apostle means sent out. Maybe when the church sent him out, that's when
as well as an eyewitness. And he was already an eyewitness
of the resurrection.
Of the resurrection. So he was already an eyewitness of that. To be called out, was on the road to Damascus, obviously. And then his being set apart with Ananias. And with Barnabas, he was being set apart. Because he was given no unclean, not setting apart any unclean thing. From Paul's perspective, so.
The Lord said to Ananias, as he was going to meet Paul, he says, "Go thy way. He is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the times and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake." So I get the sense from that verse clearly that that's the Lord has in view Paul being an apostle from there. But that's not the Lord speaking to Paul. That's the Lord speaking to Ananias about Paul. So,
and he refers to himself as an apostle out of time. In another epistle from the standpoint of, I wasn't in the same time period of the other epistle. I was called later, but I was still a called epistle of Christ.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so So then he writes 1 Corinthians. That's letter F. You got that, right? Did we say that one?
No.
Oh, letter F. He wrote 1 Corinthians. After these things, then, he visits. He writes a letter that's lost. He gets feedback from the house of Chloe. He hears from the church other things with questions and problems. They're challenging his apostleship. He writes 1 Corinthians to deal with some of the problems in the church. The situation still does not improve. So Paul finds it necessary to leave his Ephesian ministry. So now this is on Paul's third missionary journey. So this is kind of interesting when you're reading in the book of Acts and you're in chapter 19. Look at chapter 19. It doesn't say anywhere in Acts chapter 19 that Paul left Ephesus to go to Corinth. But you know what Paul did in Acts 19 when he was in Ephesus? He left Ephesus and he visited Corinth, which means he had to go across the sea because Ephesus was in Turkey, Asia Minor. He had to cross the Aegean Sea there. So in Acts chapter 19, though, it does say this in verse 10. This continued by the space of 2 years, so that all dwelt in Asia heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jews and Greeks. So Paul was in Ephesus for that 2-year period, and the gospel went throughout Asia. But while he was there also, he took this trip back to Corinth. So that's letter G now. He visits Corinth for a second visit to set things in order. This is often called, and I term it the painful visit. The painful visit. It says here in your Wiersbe book, he terms it a hasty visit to Corinth. He made a hasty visit to Corinth, but the results again were unsatisfactory. So now, how do we get these different visits? Okay, now let's look at some of these verses, because again, you read these little details. It's in the Bible, so it's not necessarily the most exciting stuff, but these are details that are in Scripture that help us to piece together his life, his travels, his writings. So go to 2 Corinthians chapter 13, please. 2 Corinthians 13. And Paul is hoping to visit them again for, what does it say in chapter 13, verse 1? For the third time. Okay? So his first time was the his second missionary journey when he started that church. His second time was this painful visit. Now, in chapter 12:14, he also refers to a third visit. He said, the third time, I am ready to come to you. So he wants to make a third visit to them. And in chapter 13, verse 2, he tells them that he had this second visit with them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so who's got that? Eunice, could you please read 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse.
I told you before and foretell you as if I were present the second time. And being absent now, I write to them which heretofore have sinned, and to all other, that if I come again, I will not spare.
Okay. So it sounded like he went a little easy with them on that thing. But if I come again, you know what, I'm just gonna lay it all out there for you. But he says, if I were present, as if I were present the second time. Okay, so he mentions that's a second visit, which we believe was taken again while he was doing Ephesian ministry. He went back to Corinth. Then Paul follows up this visit with another letter, which has all been lost. This letter is often called a severe letter. And in Wiersbe, he calls it a sharp letter. He wrote them a sharp letter carried by Titus. And that's in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and 8 through 12. We won't read all those verses. But when he says in chapter 7 and verse 8, we're in 2 Corinthians, right? Chapter 7, verse 8, he says, for though I made you sorry with a letter, I do not repent. Mm-hmm. So many people believe that was not 1 Corinthians, but another letter between 1 and 2 Corinthians that was also lost. This is often called a severe letter or a sharp letter. Then after this, so after these visits and after these 3 letters, Paul writes his 4th letter, 2 Corinthians, and then he makes the 3rd visit after that. Because when he writes 2 Corinthians, he says, I'm going to visit you again the 3rd time. Okay, am I losing you? So the bottom line is he writes them 4 letters and he makes overall at least 3 visits to them. And we have 1 and 2 Corinthians through that. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay, real quick now. We're gonna move fast and we're gonna finish this little section right here. The very nature of the church means there will be problems. The church is in the world, as it must be, but when the church gets into the world or the world gets into the church, which ought not to happen, problems occur. So Paul writes, because the world got in the church. And we always have to fight the world, personally in our lives. We have to fight worldliness. Love not the world. And we have to keep the world out of the church as well. And that's not easy. Letter A, set right the disorder in the church, Paul writes to them. And that's his first line of business. He will deal with these party factions in the church. And isn't church known for like division? Especially Baptists. Like there's an old saying, let's be like a Baptist church and split. You know, when it's time to go, like 2 friends talking, let's be like a Baptist church, let's split, you know. So there's an old saying, Baptist churches fight and then splinter, you know, or split. So there was this disorder. So there must have been a Baptist church, definitely. So the Baptist church goes, oh, just kidding. Okay. Letter B, to answer questions put forward to him. That's the verse we read in 7:1. They had asked him questions. And then to expound on the great doctrine of the resurrection. Those are at least 3 major reasons he wrote. So now, the date and place of where Corinthians was written. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians while he ministered for 2 years in Ephesus. Paul's first visit in Corinth was while Gallio was deputy of Achaeus. Inscriptions are found that indicate Gallio came to office around AD 51. Paul's letter had to be sometime after this, probably around AD 55. Now, saying that, there's often slight disagreements as to the dates of writings, a year or 2 off. Where did I read this? I think Wiersbe said it was in AD 57. I forget exactly where I read that. But there could be disagreement. But we're going to stick with AD 55 as the time when 1 Corinthians was written. So here's an outline of Corinthians. Chapters 1 through 4, he deals with unity. Okay, unity. Dealing with the divisions in the church. The church ought not to be divided but united. They were plagued with the cult of personality, and division in the church is inconsistent in light of the nature of our calling, our message, our church, and our Christian ministry. So that's chapters 1 through 4. Then letter B is immorality. There was sexual immorality, judicial immorality, marital immorality. So he deals with morality, immorality, that kind of thing. Then chapters 8 through 10, he deals with liberty, Christian liberty. And then chapters 11 through 14, he deals with worship. And I tried so hard to get like a word that ends with, you know, T-Y.
Worship team.
Yeah, worship team. You know, I could picture the language a little bit, right? So, but anyway, so we have, well, just for memorization's sake, you know, it's easy to memorize Okay. So we have unity, immorality, liberty, worship team. And then, so in that worship, he deals with church ordinances, spiritual gifts, and we can get into that as we go through Corinthians. The tongue speakings, which of course has been a great confusion, I believe, in our day as well. And then letter E is eternity. You might want to put in parentheses the resurrection. He deals with the resurrection. And then letter F, he deals with generosity. Okay. So we got the TYs on everything. So if you think of a good word that somehow relates to worship, T, that we could maybe we should just make a new word. Why not? Other people make words like selfies. Okay, so that's the outline. You will need to know the outline of the main points. So let's say the outline: unity, immorality, liberty, worship, eternity, and generosity. So we're going to work on that. We'll try to learn that outline, and praise God, we made it through.